Hey, it's Inspiration4U.
Hello, welcome to another edition of the PSO Inspiration4U podcast with Unit 4. I'm Bryce Wolf. I'm a Senior Manager of Industry Solutions here at Unit 4, and I've got the honor of welcoming Eric Kimberling, who's the founder and CEO of Third Stage Consulting. Thank you for joining us today, Eric.
Hi, Bryce. Thanks for having me.
So, Eric, could you just tell us a little bit about your experience with professional services organizations and just kind of your professional experience to date?
Sure. So I'll maybe start with my overall experience and then dive into the professional experience piece of it. I've been in the professional services space for my entire career, having been a consultant now for about 25 years. Started off at one of the big four consulting firms back in the late 90s, and now I'm CEO of a company called Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent consulting firm that helps clients with their digital transformations. My experience with professional services, obviously being in the industry for 25 years is one component of that, but also on the consulting side, consulting to other professional services organizations. That's something I've done probably for the last 12 or 15 years of my career, along with experience in other industries as well.
Okay. So you've got a fair bit of experience in the just professional experience and in professional services as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that really lends itself to the topic of conversation today, which is digital transformation. So really focusing on those tips on how to avoid common pitfalls that organizations see with that digital transformation. So what are some common challenges that we see amongst professional services organizations?
Yeah, so I mean, you certainly have the common challenges that you see across all industries, which is, a failure to find the right software, a failure to have the right project governance and controls in place, not having a clear vision of what it is you want out of technology, that sort of thing. So those are more broader cross-industry challenges that organizations face. But within professional services in particular, it's really interesting because there's pretty unique challenges within professional services, both from a technological perspective, but also operationally as well. And that includes the main fact or the main issue, which is that it's such a labor-intensive industry, and therefore human capital management and just managing employees and human resources, HR processes, all that stuff is even more important for professional services firms than most other industries. So I think you've got that sort of human complexity that's a bit more unique and a little bit more magnified in professional services firms. But in addition to that,
Okay.
it's also a challenge to manage resources. Managing resources and projects is sometimes a lot different or a little less tangible and cut and dry as managing a production or a manufacturing shop floor, which is very predictable and repeatable and that sort of thing. So those are two of the big challenges I see that are fairly unique to professional services organizations.
Okay, so to touch on that first point there, it sounds like it's much more than just the technology and the transformation side of things. It's the people that makes it so different from other organizations that have this digital transformation, because with a services organization, it's even more so than other industries. It's all about the people, because the people are your resource. They are your commodity. So it's really important to make sure that they go along on that journey. So what are some of the impacts to the people that you see?
Sure. Yeah, and I'd take what you said just one step further, which is the people are actually the product too. That's the product you're selling to other organizations or to your customers. And so some of the ways to manage that or things to think about it starts with, in my opinion, it starts with culture. What kind of culture is it you're trying to create? What kind of culture do you have now? How might you want to bend that culture or pivot on that culture to elaborate on the strengths you have, but adjust for the future and constantly improving in that area. And so creating that deliberate culture of what kind of culture is it you're trying to create is one important component. And then certainly another component is just looking at the overall employee experience. What kind of employee experience do you want to create? Which, by the way, ties very much into the cultural component that I just described. And so, having a clear understanding of what that employee experience should look like. That's something that I would recommend to really any organization, but even more so for PSO organizations. And then, I guess a third thing I'll mention is that there's a lot of technology out there in the marketplace that can enable a digital transformation, but there's not a lot of technologies that can do this stuff really well. The PSO stuff, the human capital management, all the stuff we're talking about here, the nuances of managing a PSO. So I think that's the other piece of it too, is just making sure you're looking at solutions that are built for PSO firms, because you can't take a manufacturing-based software, for example, or a retail-based software and sort of force fit it into a PSO. I suppose you can, but it's not going to be pretty. So I think that's the other consideration as well.
Right. You want to make sure you're using using technology that's built for purpose, which is to support the people. If you're a services organization, it's making sure that you have the right tool that you're selecting, not something maybe that's more geared towards manufacturing or retail, but really one that's focused on services organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, one last dimension that comes to mind is the knowledge management, just the knowledge capital within the organization and how you manage that knowledge capital too. For a lot of professional services organizations, that knowledge base or that collective knowledge and capturing that collective knowledge is super important. So you want to look at that as well, which again, to your point, very different than a manufacturer of widgets. It's just a different process and different set of capabilities that you need from your technology and your operations.
Right. And then, so it sounds like change is something that's really important to take into consideration with this digital transformation. So when you come in and you have these customers that you're working with, as you're doing this analysis, what are some of the things that you look at with regards to the change for the organization, for the people?
Yeah, so one thing that's important to do is to, once you've defined that future state in terms of the culture you're trying to create, the future state operating model, how you think technology could help enable that future state operating model. Once you've defined that future state, then you really want to look at, well, what is that impact to the organization? And more specifically, what is the impact to individual work groups and locations and even just individuals in general? What are the nuanced impacts that this transformation is going to have on your people? And again, this is all stuff that I'd say to other industry practitioners as well, but this is even more important in PSO organizations, because the change management, the human component, is going to be even more important, because again, it's sort of a double whammy. If you don't manage the human side well, that's a problem with, say, a manufacturer or retailer, but it's an even bigger problem with PSOs, because not only is it an employee, just like every organization have, but again, it's your product. So if you have a negative impact on your product and you don't manage that human component, the stress and the morale impact of humans within a PSO organization is felt a lot more, not only internally, but more importantly, and perhaps more in a more risky way, it's felt by customers as well. So that's why that human piece is so important, and getting that change management piece is right. But it all starts with identifying that gap, the gap between where you are today, what the future state's going to look like, and how it affects individuals within the organization.
And so how do you do that? How do you help bridge that gap for what an organization's doing today versus what they'll be doing tomorrow? What are some things that you look at for helping to design that future state to help the organization run efficiently through this digital transformation that they're doing?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I guess I'll start off by contrasting to what you shouldn't do. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations do what you shouldn't do, which is you sort of lead with technology. You say, let's put technology in place. That's going to determine what our future state looks like. We'll train people on how to use the technology, and they'll learn to adopt it, and everything will be fine. But the reality is that's backwards. You should be starting with the business needs and defining what that future state is, defining what the impacts are. Then you leverage technology to help you get there. And it sounds like a subtle shift or a nuanced way of just slicing hairs, but it's really important. If you do that backwards, you're not going to get to that change impact. You're not going to have that focus and that understanding of what the impact of the organization and to your people are. So that's what comes to mind, is just making sure you start with that change assessment, but then going a step further, once you understand current state versus future state, what the impacts are to people, then you want to develop a change strategy and plan that addresses what those impacts are. So in other words, it's not going to be, or it shouldn't be, a one-size-fits-all change management plan that would use for any PSO. You want it to be unique to what it is you're trying to accomplish and what the impacts are between current state and future state.
Okay, so to start with that impact analysis, what you'll do is you'll look at the people and process, technology being the last component of it, because people and process are the most important things for that impact analysis, and then overlaying the technology on it. Once the impact analysis is complete, that's where we start with the change strategy, which takes all of those things into account. And then what are some things that go into a change strategy for a professional services organization? Once you've done that impact analysis, what's kind of an example, I guess, if you will, that you've seen for that change strategy? What are the components of it?
Sure. Well, first, in maybe taking the change impact a step further, is to define what the future organizational design is going to be. So defining how roles and responsibilities are going to look, and doing more of that org design piece of it. And certainly, to the extent that people's processes and their technologies and tool sets are going to change, how does that affect, and what does that role and responsibility look for different positions in the organization? Well, once you've done that, then you get into a lot more change impact discussions, ongoing communications, using change agents to help communicate what some of the changes are, and to elicit two-way communication. There's a lot of different tactics that can be used. I think the key, though, is to look well beyond the box, I guess you'd say, or the traditional way of thinking about change management, which is training and communications. Training and communications is very important, don't get me wrong, but that's only a tiny piece of change management. It's all the upfront stuff. It's all the stuff that happens leading up to the training or the end user training before go live. That's the stuff that's most important, because the way I'd like to view change management is you should be able to manage the change effectively to where by the time you get to end user training, it's sort of a non-event and there's no real surprises. It's just more of a confirmation of, I already know that my job's changing. I know what my new processes are. Now I just need to understand exactly how this technology is going to work to fit within it. Too often, organizations find that at go live or at pre-go live training, you get a lot of freak out moments. And what I mean by freak out moments, which is a very technical term, by the way, is you get you get people that are surprised. They're hearing for the first time that their job is going to massively change, or that you're going to take away that spreadsheet that they used to manage their whole job for the last 20 years. There shouldn't be any surprises like that, any material surprises. It should be more that stuff needs to move up front in the implementation. And so that's the key, is how do you draw out those freak out moments earlier in the project so that by the time you get to end user training, the dust is settled organizationally. You're not 100% comfortable yet, but at least you've worked through the major issues or surprises. And now it's a matter of just getting the formality of, now we're going to really dial in on how to use the technology and how those new processes are going to work exactly.
Yeah, it sounds like by the time you get to end user training, you want it to be more of the how-to rather than the why and who made this decision and why is my life changing. And you've got people that, as you said, they have the freak out moments.
Right.
So something that you said, one of the things that you had mentioned when you were talking about the overall change management piece is something that I find really interesting. What is a change agent?
Sure. So a change agent is really another word, or it's oftentimes used interchangeably with super user, or oftentimes it's sort of a blended role where, super user is someone that would be a representative from one department or one location or some hybrid of both, that is sort of the business person that understands the technology in the future state really well, and it's sort of a support role of, that's the person that's going to that I can go to for help, or that's going to give me the information I need. That's more, a lot of times people think of super users more post-implementation, but those same people oftentimes are the change agents, which is they're the ones that'll go back to their teams and help communicate what some of these changes are. They'll help elicit their feedback from the team in terms of what their concerns are, what their fears are, what their freakouts are, all that stuff. You want to get that out from using the change agents. It's a great way to do it. So it's a structured way to make sure that while we're all over here in our war room doing all the project-based stuff day to day, that we're involving people from the business that are actually living the reality of operations while we're over here in the war room for the project, trying to get the project done. They're the people on the front lines that are working with the other people on the front lines to make sure they're understanding what the changes are, that we're getting feedback, and really using them as sort of a conduit between the project team or the core team and the frontline people that are going to be affected by the project.
Interesting. So a change agent would then be more than just a super user. It's going to be more than someone that is just technically savvy, if you will. They adopt new tools quickly, because that's traditionally what I think of as a super user. But it sounds like this change agent needs to be more than that. It needs to be able to be an advocate for change within the business process, to be a good listener, to listen to their teammates, to be able to hear that feedback, and then be able to speak up and take that back to the team that's designing the new process, the new tools, with everything that comes through. So it sounds like it's more than just somebody who's very technical.
Absolutely. It's more important that they have a solid understanding of the business the way it is today and the business the way it's going to be in the future. And so that's what makes the role so hard, is because a lot of times when you have highly tenured people that really understand the business, it's harder for them to change, or it's harder for them to think outside the box of what could be. And so it's really hard to find that skill set, but you have to find someone who understands the business, has been around for long enough to know kind of where the bones are buried and all that good stuff, but not so entrenched in the current state that they can't think about what the way things could be, and they can't help people connect the dots between the two. So it's a pretty unique skill set. It is hard to find, but I'd say it very much is a business-focused role. I'd say 80-20, business versus 20%. Technically focused. And on the technical side is not so much technical support. It's more just understanding, here's how the technology works. This is the workflow. Here's how we do our processes in the technology. So they're not necessarily like IT support. It's a different sort of, more of a functional technology role.
Yeah, so then it's more this change agent in the change management view with this super user is somebody who has a good understanding of the business process, of the way it is, of the way it will be, can communicate why we're doing it this way, more so than somebody who's super tech savvy, because that's technical support, and that's not necessarily this role that we're talking about. This change agent, so something I kind of picked up on as you were talking about is there's a lot of resistance to change as we have our current state, and then we have that transition to the future state, everything that we've done for it. So this change agent, it sounds like, is somebody that helps with that resistance. So in my experience, there's generally a lot of resistance as we move to a new process, to a new technology. So how do you manage that resistance? What does a change agent have to do with it? And then what are some other things, some other strategies that you have with managing that resistance to the change?
Well, it's a great question. The first thing that we typically do and recommend to our clients is to measure where the pockets of resistance might come from. And the key here is that you can't wait until you see the resistance. I mean, most organizations won't do anything about the resistance until they see it. They see that someone is pushing back, or a certain part of the company is not on board with this project or with the changes that are coming downstream. And by then it's I don't want to say it's too late, but it's a lot harder to address it when you've gotten to that point, because the resistance has generated enough energy and momentum that it's a lot harder to push back on it by that point. So the key is to really...
How do you measure it?
Yeah,
how do you measure potential future resistance to change that may or may not come?
Well, you measure things that are likely to cause resistance. So I'll give you an example. One example would be, let's just say it's an organization that maybe a lot of people listening can relate to this within their organizations. But let's just say your organization is one that assesses itself, or if you ask someone within the organization, they'll say that we're a very siloed organization. We don't communicate well across departments. Let's just say that's sort of a finding.
I've never seen that. I've never seen that before, Eric.
I'm sure none of your customers have. No, yeah. But a lot of times what you do is, we'll start off by doing an organizational readiness assessment, which is an online survey meant to ask a bunch of questions around communication, leadership, collaboration, innovation, just sort of questions that are unpacking who is this organization and what's the culture right now. And so you're trying to quantify something that's very subjective. So, and that's intentional. We want to quantify it so we can see how it compares to other organizations and how different departments and different parts of the organization compare within itself. But once we do that, then you start to, back to the example, you might uncover during that survey and assessment, you might find that there's a pretty strong perception within the company that there is a lack of communication, lack of collaboration. On the surface, you think, well, that's why we need to put in new technology, and that's why we're going through this project. So what's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal because that now you're forcing pretty significantly and pretty quickly, relatively quickly, you're forcing a level of collaboration and end-to-end business processes and integrated workflows, integrated systems that is going to force that collaboration. But that's different than where you are today. It very much is probably the direction you want to go, but you have to recognize that there is going to be resistance to that. It's just it's a bit of a cultural shock. And so you have to recognize that, yes, collaboration's better. Even if employees say that collaboration is a good thing, it's still a culture shock to change overnight what you've done for years or decades prior to this project. So that's the way you start to quantify is you look at what kind of scores and ratings people are giving the organization itself, and you do this across a broad sample of a pretty large sample within the organization. So you're getting a complete picture of the culture, and then you look at where those pockets of resistance might be, and that collaboration is a big one. Another cause of resistance oftentimes is there's a distrust of management or leadership. So if you're an organization that just doesn't trust management, or maybe the company has gone through some recent tough times, and therefore there were some layoffs, and people blame the executive leadership for that. You just have to recognize that's a source of resistance. There's going to be resistance that comes from that, and so you have to anticipate what that is and how you modify and tailor your change strategy and plan to address the fact that that's the source of resistance that you're likely to face. You just don't want to wait until people start to revolt or push back on the project later on as it goes.
And I feel like that's probably pretty common, right? You have leadership that's not being trusted for this change because we're changing something. We're changing something that we've always done it this way. That's the most common thing that I hear is, why would we do it differently? We've always done it this way. We're in a good place. We're fine. Even if you're not in a good place, there's that level of comfort that makes you feel like you're in a good place. So for those types of change resistance, there's probably a special strategy that you need to do. There's certain things that you need to do that would be different from a different pocket of resistance. And for a services organization, that's probably something that's pretty common. So do you have any examples of how you've solved that, what you've done to be able to help with that change resistance?
Sure. Yeah, so it depends on what the change resistance is, but let's just stick with the distrust of management. If there's a distrust of management, or another common one is there's a perception that there's not enough communication from management. People are craving more direction or more communication about what's going on from management. Well, if that's the case, then maybe what we do as part of our change strategy is we double down on the whole concept or the strategy of having more messaging come from some of those key leaders. So in other words, rather than having it being the project team or the CIO or even the change agents within the organization that we talked about before, those people can still be part of the communication plan, but you might be more focused on leadership delivered communications, which is almost always a good idea to begin with, but you might just want to do more of it because people are craving that, and that's part of the resistance you might see. Because if you go through the project and you just keep things the way they are, people already have this perception they don't trust management, or they're not getting enough information from management, then they're going to be a bit skeptical of this project. So it's important to have that dialogue and to create that connection in this case or example, that connection between leadership and the frontline employees.
Okay. So is that something, do you see that often? Is it more something else? It seems like this is probably a pretty common one, though. Are there other major resistance to change, those pockets, other ones, or are those kind of the main two that you see for services organizations especially?
Yeah, those are big ones. I'd say in services organizations, another big one, trying to think of how to articulate this in a a politically correct way, but a lot of times when you get knowledge-based workers that are very smart. Not to say that other people outside of PSO are not smart, but when you get a service-based organization, if they're highly educated, potentially highly paid, whatever the case may be, or at least higher paid or higher educated than some other fields, that can be a strength, but it can also work against you. And I found that a lot of PSOs with really smart people, especially like, for example, we had one client that had a bunch of PhDs and engineers, sort of their employee base, and the very smart people. But sometimes the really smart people are the ones that they're even more resistant to change because they know their stuff. They don't need you to tell them how to make their job better or whatever. So I think that's sort of a unique nuance within PSO. But even, another one is, aside from whether, someone's a PhD or has no college degree or whatever their education is, setting that aside, another common one is very common in PSO organizations and even other industries as well, is this dynamic of ownership and heroics. So in other words, you as the organization, or you as my boss, Bryce, you value me because I can get stuff done. I can power through these broken systems and broken processes. I've created this really cool spreadsheet that helps manage and track all this stuff. And the minute you put in a new system that automates some of that, that's a threat to me. Now suddenly I don't feel as worthy or as value add to the organization. And by the way, what does that mean to my job if you take away my spreadsheet and suddenly you don't need me to be a hero? You've got a repeatable, predictable process now and a technology tool that does a lot of what I used to do. So now suddenly...
Yeah, where's my value?
Yeah. So you've got to create that value. What is my value going forward? It's going to look different. I'm not going to be managing the spreadsheet that I have managed for 20 years. Maybe that's not my value anymore, but I've got some other value. But I need to know what that is, and someone needs to define that first. And that's a really important nuance, especially in PSO organizations. It's really important, but oftentimes gets overlooked.
Okay. So just to kind of summarize everything that we just talked about there, it starts with the people, the process, and then the technology. So right. That's kind of that might be the order. People, process, might be process, people, but certainly the technology coming last.
Sure.
And we do that impact analysis, the impact plan, and then the change strategy, everything that we have that's bringing together to focus on the people, process, and technology. And then, so that really that is our change management plan with everything that goes into it. Are there any other pieces that really follow it up?
I think the next step after that, once you have a sense of what you want your high-level future state processes and people to look like, is then you think, okay, now what technology options are out there that fit that model that I'm trying to pursue? It needs to fit my industry, like we talked about. It needs to be a PSO centric type of technology that was built for PSO organizations or has strong capabilities that PSO organizations need. So you identify the needs, and then you start to identify what are those sort of short list of options that meet those needs. And so then you sort of shift into the evaluation process. What kind of technology out there is going to be best for us? How do we compare it? And then how do we ultimately find that solution that's best for us and best for our industry, but also best for our specific needs within that industry?
Okay. So yeah, that technology comes last. Once you have that future state, you make sure that you're buying something that's fit for purpose for a professional services organization. You would want something that is built for and tailored to a professional services firm.
Right.
So that all makes sense to me. That's change management is such an interesting and challenging topic. Do you have any other, kind of a quick example of that light bulb moment? Because that's what it comes down to, right? You've got the people, you've got the process, you've got the technology. What's something that stands out to you for that light bulb moment of what we've done is great, where we're going is fantastic, we have the right tool in place for it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say the light bulb moment is more likely to come when not only do you find the right solution. Obviously you need that solution that's fit for purpose, fits what your needs are. But what's even more important is then connecting the dots or sort of enabling the potential of that software or of that technology via actual adoption of the software and smooth business processes and added business value. I think a lot of what you just described as far as people and process first and then technology and going through a deliberate and effective process, you're not going to feel like you're having a light bulb moment because it's going to be sort of a natural progression, and it's not going to be easy, but you're going to get to that value, that place of value and ROI and all the stuff you're trying to accomplish with your project. I guess unfortunately, it's easier to see the negative light bulb or to see the light bulb shattering when you do it the other way. That's where you kind of project comes to a halt, and it's a lot more dramatic. So you don't want that opposite of the light bulb. But when the light bulb comes on, I don't know that you really feel it. It's just sort of like a natural progression. I don't know if that really answers your question or not. But
Yeah, smooth is fast, as they say. Smooth is fast. So it's all about having that smooth process throughout, and not necessarily having that aha moment, but really making sure there's no oh no moments along the way. And that is, in effect, our aha moment that we have.
it is, yeah. That's a great way to put it.
Okay. That's really cool. Eric, I appreciate your time. We've been talking so much about change management and digital transformation. What do you like to do for fun? You're in Colorado, right?
Yep. So I am in Colorado in the United States. So I like anything outdoorsy. Would like to ski. I'm at the phase of life where I have two teenage boys that are heavily involved in school and sports in particular. So a lot of my time is consumed now with sports stuff. Prior to these teenage years, and hopefully after their teenage years, I have a strong interest in music and playing music in particular, but also just enjoying music. So I have a very musical, not background, but just a musical interest. So that's a big part of what I do. I love to read, so I'm kind of a nerdy that way, I guess you'd say. I love to read nonfiction stuff, and any chance I get, I'll do that as well.
What's the last book that you read?
I reread Crossing the Chasm from, I think it's Jeffrey Moore is the author. It's about innovation and how you get to widespread adoption of a product or service. So it's everything I read, nonfiction for the most part, is going to be business related. So I read a lot of business books, sometimes some stuff about technology too, but more business.
Okay, that's cool. Awesome. Well, I guess what instrument? So music. So that's the last book you read. But what's your instrument of choice?
Well, I started off. I first learned guitar when I was 30, so I didn't learn until I was older. So when I was 30, I started by playing acoustic guitar. Then I switched to electric guitar for a few years. Really liked that, and most recently bass guitar. So my favorite is bass right now, and it has been for the last decade or so. And that's probably the one I'd stick with. I still like to pick up an acoustic or electric guitar just to mess around every so often, but I really enjoy bass, and I think and now when I hear music, that's the thing I hear the most is the bass line. So
that's awesome.
yeah.
So I really appreciate your time, Eric. Just one last question before we go is where does an organization start with the change process? What's the best place to start with that?
The simplest, easiest, and most effective thing to start with, in my opinion, on the change side is to do that organizational assessment, to really do the survey I talked about. We also do focus groups to get some qualitative data to back the quantitative data that we get from the organizational assessment. But that'll really sort of do a lot of things. It's gonna validate and quantify some of the things you're already feeling within your culture, within your organization. But more importantly, it's also going to give you some more clear direction on, once you analyze the results, you'll have more clear direction of what it is that needs to be done from a change perspective. So I think, when we look at working with our clients, that organizational assessment takes just a relatively tiny amount of time and money in billings on our side, but it generates so much value because now you've got the lay of the land, and now you can craft a change strategy that meets those needs, rather than just sending a bunch of people to go get ProSci certified and then hoping that they come in and figure out how to do the change management. That, go get people educated in change management. Of course, that's not a bad thing, but more importantly is to make sure you have a clear direction based on your current situation and where you're headed.
Yeah, and tailored to the individual organization. I'm sure, because it's
Yeah.
not one size fits all. Even in the same industry, it's different for everybody.
Yeah, that's very true.
Awesome. Well, Eric, I appreciate your time, and thanks for taking us through the change management journey, and really only, I feel, scratching the surface on things that come to digital transformation for professional services organizations. And thanks for lending your experience with your personal life, professional life, everything that you're doing there at Third Stage Consulting. So thank you for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody, for listening here on the Inspiration4U podcast. I've been Bryce Wolf with Unit 4. We'll catch you next time.